Okay, once again I'm going to try to make it so simple that a 10-year-old can understand it. Let's talk about the one thing that no book on magnetism ever talks about, except in reference to a block wall, which is a description, not an explanation. It means nothing. So, what is a magnet? We're talking about a physical magnet. A magnet, obviously, is a physical object. It has been made coherent from increased dielectric capacitance or induction from another magnetic source. So, if you want to think of a magnet as a counterspatial laser, that is fine. So, what are we referring to when we talk about a magnet? Well, the smallest particle of matter in the universe, since they were talking about a hydrogen atom, is still a magnet. It has magnetic divergence and convergence, centrifugal, centripetal reciprocation, just as this huge 2 by 2 by 1 inch block magnet over here on the left. Let's take a look at our magnetic viewing film. See that center line between the north and the south pole? Idiots incorrectly called a block wall. That is the counterspatial center of that magnet. It doesn't matter if I use field viewing film or if I use the Tim Vanderelli ferrocell invention. It doesn't matter what viewing medium that I use. You will see this on any magnet or multiple magnets together. Obviously, if I have two of these together, it will be in the center. It will be right here. If I have a second magnet here, identical, and they're together, they're combined in acceleration. Obviously, the quote-unquote block wall, i.e. the dielectric inertial plane, will shift immediately to the center. Now, this insentient object, i.e. the magnet, the really important stuff is the simple stuff nobody thinks about. So, what is a magnet? It is a coherent object. Counterspace self-centers. Why does a magnet have two poles? Why does a hydrogen atom have two poles? A hydrogen atom is no different than this 1 pound magnet. So what's the difference? Polarization, we're talking about magnetism. Coherency of multiple atoms or molecules, in this case neodymium iron boron, or it could be a samarium cobalt, or it could be a ferrous magnet, referring to a magnet. We're talking about magnetism versus a magnet. Magnetism is polarization. So you want to talk about a monopole? Obviously a monopole doesn't exist. So what would be a genuine reference to monopole? It would be counterspace itself. The center point between all spatial modalities of a magnet or any atomic source, which is definitionally polarized. A magnet is a coherent object. Over here on the right we have coherency, over here on the left we have incoherency. There is no difference, and if you don't get this, you never will, because Mother Nature is divinely simple and she doesn't do any fucking math. There is no math in Mother Nature. Math is about extrapolating complex phenomena and their interactions. Mother Nature, before any interactions, plural, there is no math. Okay? There is no math in Mother Nature. Gravity is magnetism. All gravity is incoherent counterspatial acceleration. There are only two principles in the universe: force and motion, and inertia and acceleration. Take a look at our chart over here in a second, but why are there two poles on any magnet? There's obviously no such thing as a monopole. There's obviously no such thing as monopolar magnetism. Magnetism is definitionally polarized. Anything that's polarized obviously has two poles. That is because any spatial extrapolation of any phenomenal object, whether it's this huge magnet over here, or whether it's a hydrogen atom or any other atom, any spatial extrapolation is space. And what is the antithesis of space? That's right, kiddies, it's counterspace. CS. Counterspace self-centers. Counterspace self-centers. So why does a magnet have two poles? It doesn't. A magnet doesn't have two poles. Well, I thought you just got done fucking telling us that there's no such thing as a monopole. That's right. A magnet does not have two poles. What a magnet does have is coherency and polarization. If I take two magnets, I bring them together at the point of acceleration, lowest counterspatial acceleration. This quote-unquote block wall of these two magnets will become one. There will be immediate shift of the counterspatial of these two magnets into the center. You can see that on the ferrocell, you can see it on magnetic viewing film. There's a dozen other testing criteria that you can see that on. It doesn't matter. So, where's the contradiction there in what I just said? I just got done saying two things that superficially seems contradictory. There are no two poles, but obviously magnetism is polarization. Well, what does that mean? It means that counterspace is counterspace. What's the opposite of counterspace? It is space. Any magnet is a spatial extrapolation. This physical object is a spatial conglomeration of coherent neodymium iron boron assemblages is coherent. That is the definition of the magnet on top of the pre-existent polarization of any atom in the universe. Doesn't matter whether it's ionized gas or free hydrogen atoms out in the intergalactic cosmos. They are all polarized. What we're talking about here is a coherent and polarized object. Any spatial extrapolation is polarization necessitatively. Yet, I said that there are no poles in a magnet. Obviously there is compression and rarefaction. There's compression on the South Pole and rarefaction on the North Pole. Compression, by the way, is time dilation, which means more time, and rarefaction equals time compression, which equals less time, which is why all the biological experiments are actually different. So what are we talking about? I've already said that there aren't two poles of a magnet, so we're talking about counterspace. This indivisible, incommensurable, point non-specific incommensurability at the midpoint of every magnet, which is self-centering, is counterspatial. It is the opposite of any spatial extrapolation, whether it's atomic or this large magnet. What is driving this magnet? It is point non-specific. If I were to have a slicer, and I could actually slice this neodymium iron boron, which is brittle, it won't take the slicing, but let's say I could slice it like Jell-O. Every little slice, down to the thinnest micrometer imaginable, will self-center. And what is self-centering? It is counterspace, that is inertia and acceleration. Magnetism is force and motion, extrapolation, polarization, necessitatively so, because any spatial extrapolation, whether it's atomic, as in the case of a hydrogen atom or any atom, helium, doesn't matter what the hell it is, or this large magnet, necessitatively means that there's a counterspatial center. Whether it is coherent or not, say this magnet is not a magnet, it has not been made coherent yet, it wasn't zapped with a dielectric, it wasn't zapped with a pulse from a magnetizer. Of course it has been. It is not yet coherent. That is why there's no difference between gravity and magnetism. There's only one field, by the way. There are many field modalities. Well, there's actually three field modalities: gravity, electricity, and magnetism. Here we have our little chart over here on the right. Over here we have dielectricity. On the right we have magnetism. Over here we have inertia, acceleration. On magnetism we have force and motion. Everything over here on the right is force and motion. Is spatial. Everything over here on the left is counterspatial. How is gravity and electricity both counterspatial and spatial? Gravity is a dielectric condensate, as in the premise of matter. Obviously it is incoherent. That's why there's no difference between gravity and magnetism. The only thing that the idiot Einstein got right is that if you can't explain it to a barmaid, then you don't understand it. Of course, the only problem is that all of modern science is based upon the false premise, as Tesla pointed out, that there's no such thing as time and space acting on anything. Time and space are neither fields nor forces. Time and space do not act on anything. Only two premises in the universe: force and motion and inertia and acceleration. Only those two. Gravity is magnetism. We have to differentiate out polarization versus coherency. This magnet has been zapped, either be done by induction or pulse from a magnetizer, where there is coherency versus incoherency. Then polarization versus coherency. Polarization is necessitatively explicative only in denotation as meaning the opposite of space. So when we talk about polarity versus a monopole, if you want to think of counterspace as the monopole, then think of it that way. But there's no such thing as a point or a line. There's only a point line. Nobody on Earth or anywhere in the universe can make a point without first making a line. See, there's a point? Well, guess what? I made a line to make a point. And nobody can make a line without making a series of points. That's why there's no such thing as a line, and there's no such thing as a point in the universe. There's only the point line. That's why there's no such thing as a monopole. Any pole, necessitatively, is an assemblages of lines, the loss of inertia and acceleration, expressed as force and motion. The most important thing in the universe, which you won't find in any textbook, in academia or otherwise, other than the mention of a block wall, which is a description, not an explanation. No explanation is ever given for what this is. Why does it self-center? Why does a magnet have two poles? Well, it doesn't have two poles. Well, what do you mean? Obviously, there's a north pole and a south pole to every magnet. I can see that underneath the ferrocell. The ferrofilm viewing fluid, ferrofluid, I can see it underneath the ferrocell or the magnetic viewing film. Well, there aren't two poles. Well, what does that mean? It means that this object, whether it's an atomic size or the size of a magnet, is a spatial object which necessitates polarization because magnetism is nothing other than coherency of the innate polarization of an assemblage of atoms or molecules. This is coherency. When we talk about coherency, we're talking about a magnet. That's why a 5-watt light bulb you can't read by, but a 5-watt laser will burn a hole in your ass and make you jump right up through the roof. If you want to think of it in that terms, that's fine. How does the center of these two magnets, when they're being brought together, know, I use the word know loosely obviously, know to self-center? Because this is the counterspatial point at which these two spatial objects are coming together. That is why the counterspatial dielectric inertial plane will self-center. This is coherency of innate polarization, the interatomic magnetodielectricity, elasticity of a ferrous object or a samarium cobalt or a neodymium iron boron is of that nature. You have to understand two things: force and motion, inertia and acceleration. This is why gravity is no different than magnetism. Magnetism is nothing other than coherent lump of innate polarized matter. Gravity is not. Gravity is incoherent mass, which obviously has a counterspatial. Gravity is, I know you've heard it said many countless times, that gravity is an acceleration. It is not a field or a force. Well, that's correct. Fields and force are only spatially additive. Counterspatial is counterspatially multiplicative and always ends in zero. Not zero as in nothing, but no thing, no phenomena, pure inertia, i.e. the ether. There's only one field. Magnetism is not a field. It is a force and motion. Gravity is spatially additive as matter, as a dielectric condensate, but obviously it has a counterspatial component of acceleration towards counterspace. That is why all masses of any size will form spheres, because that is the tightest counterspatial geometry of any mass, of any size, will eventually form a sphere, given enough mass. Electricity, with its transverse electromagnetic components, is spatially divergent, and yet, of course, it has a z-axis counterspatial dielectric component. This is what actually, even though Walter Russell got a lot of things wrong, he's about 80% right. This is why Walter Russell actually said light doesn't move. And of course he's right, but that's a point for another conversation. If you want to think of a magnet as a counterspatial laser, then that's perfectly fine. So we're talking about point non-specific incommensurability. We're talking about force and motion versus inertia and acceleration. So now do you understand what polarity is and what coherency is? What's the difference? What are we talking about? So there aren't two poles into a magnet, two poles regarding a magnet. Well, we know there's a north and a south pole. Well, no, there's not. There are not two poles in any magnet on the universe. Samarium, cobalt, neodymium, it doesn't matter what it is. Atomic or this huge magnet being attached to the back of a cylinder magnet. There aren't two poles there. There's polarization because counterspace self-centers itself. Here we have a bifurcation of a phenomenal object that is extrapolated in space, by which necessitatively counterspace is at the center and the antinomy thereof of the spatial component, which is this magnet. I've actually coined this field incommensurability. This is the magnetodielectric binary of consubstantial conjugate system inherent to all atomic operations. Magnetodielectricity, this is spatially additive, as in the case of magnetism, where the magnet, or counterspatially multiplicative in inertial acceleration. There's only one field. That field is the ether, i.e. inertia. The loss of that inertia necessitates reciprocation, divergence, centrifugal reciprocation out of either side of this magnet. What do we mean either side of this magnet? We're looking at one magnet drawn here. What are you talking about either side? Or this magnet here. Either side of what? Either side of the center of counterspace. Magnetism is force in motion. Dielectricity, the only field which is counterspatial, is at the center of this magnet. Or if you bring two magnets together, there will be immediate self-centering. How does this occur? Why does this occur? You'll find no fucking book in academia that ever explains this simple premise. If you find one fucking book in academia that explains to you why bringing two magnets together will immediately shift the quote-unquote block wall, which is actually the dielectric inertial plane, to the center of this magnet, let me know, because I have every book ever written on magnetism. Every one. And none of them explain it. None of them. What is lacking in academia? The most important thing understood by the Greeks, the Indians, the Egyptians, was the idea of projective geometry. Space and counterspace. Inertia and acceleration versus force and motion. The unmanifest inertia, the center of the nave of the wheel of every potential modality of extrapolation, i.e. counterspace. Yes, we're kind of getting into metaphysics here. So, now I hope you understand this. There aren't two poles in a magnet. Well, yeah, we got a north pole and a south. No, you don't. You don't have a north pole or a south pole in any magnet. Well, what do you mean by that? It makes no fucking sense. We know that there is a north pole and a south pole in every magnet, including down to the little tiny hydrogen atom. Even it has empirically been measured to have magnetic properties, i.e. polarization, which is what magnetism is. It is force in motion divergence, which of course reciprocates as convergence. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about spatially additive phenomena, whether it's an atom or this magnet, necessitates that counterspace self-centers, just like fluid dynamics. You cut a huge hole in the bottom of a bucket of water, the water will flow right through the bottom of that hole. Why? Why is water self-centering itself due to that hole? It's no different than a hole in a bucket. Imagine two buckets here and a magnet. Yes, is a really crude analogy. Self-centering itself in the center of this spatial object. Counterspace self-center is not located at. Obviously, I cannot cut this magnet in the middle and show you counterspace. I cannot subdivide, neither can anybody on this in this universe, subdivide a magnet into a north pole and a south pole. I can cut it 1,000,000 times top to bottom. And every little slice will have a quote-unquote north pole and a south pole. Well, what the fuck does that mean? Excuse my language. What does that mean? It means counterspace is self-centering. Every little magnet, whether it's an atom or this huge block magnet, is a spatial extrapolation, a conglomeration of multiple atoms and molecules by which there has been a coherent induction or charge from a magnetizer, at which counterspace will self-center itself at the center of this spatial object. Space and counterspace. What is space? Space is necessitatively the posterior attribute of a magnetic divergence, i.e. force and motion. What is counterspace? It is inertia, it is acceleration, it is the field, the only field. Yes, that's right, kiddies. There are not 4 fields of dielectricity, gravity, magnetism, and electricity. There is only one fucking field. One field. The ether, the inertia. The loss of that field as expressed in force and motion, the loss of inertia, i.e. magnetism, is expressed in mass. Gravity and magnetism are one and the same thing. The only thing that magnetism is divergence. Gravity is a conglomeration of dielectric condensates, which itself has magnetism, but is not coherent. Obviously the Earth, other than referring to the center of the core of the Earth, of course, being a magnet, it itself is coherent. We have a magnetosphere around the Earth, but referring to just a large anonymous lump of matter is incoherent, and yet it has gravity. Gravity is nothing other than a reference to counterspace. So, electricity with its transverse components also is no different. At the center of those transverse components of electricity and magnetism is the field, dielectricity. There's only one field, force and inertia, dielectricity, the ether. The loss of that inertia expressed with a spatial posterior attribute of space and time. Space and time are neither a field nor are they force. They do not act on anything. So, what we've understood from this video, hopefully anyway, that even though we all know that a magnet has a north pole and a south pole, there are no poles in a magnet. We have to reiterate that. There are no poles in a magnet. So what are we referring to? We're referring to a spatial object which necessitates counterspace, self-center itself, at the opposite antinomies of which, i.e. the center between north and south, centers itself at the antinomy of spatial extrapolation and spatial expression as a phenomena, either an atom or a large magnet, or any size magnet for that matter. Bring 2 magnets together, you have self-centering. We all see that, we all know that. A magnet, referring to what we all understand and ideate as a magnet, is nothing other than coherency of what is innately polarized matter. All matter in the universe is polarized. It is not, however, coherent. In the case of the Earth's core, it is coherent to a certain degree, and hence we have the magnetosphere. This magnet has been magnetized. You can either do it by induction or a charge from a magnetizer coil. So we have coherency. That is why there's also no difference between gravity and magnetism. Gravity is a move towards counterspace. Magnetism is an expression of a divergence which reciprocates. It itself has a counterspace. There's no such thing as an absence of counterspace in any field modality expression, obviously. There are not 2 fields, not 4 fields, gravity, electricity, magnetism, dielectricity. There's only one field. On the left side over here, we obviously have counterspace. We have force, we have inertia and acceleration on the right side. Gravity, electricity, and magnetism. We have force and motion. We have space. And on the left side, we have counterspace. The acceleration of gravity by gravity, what we think of as gravity, is nothing other than a move towards counterspace. When we talk about gravity, however, we're talking about assemblage of mass. Mass itself necessitates polarization. Doesn't matter how large or small the body is. So here you have a binary of both space and counterspace, in gravity and electricity. The antinomies, force and motion, inertia and acceleration. In the middle of all modalities is counterspace. That is the field. That field is expressed by 1 over 5 to the power of -3. I hope that wasn't too long and drawn out. So now you understand, why does a magnet have 2 poles? Why are there 2 poles necessitatively on any magnet? Well, there aren't any poles on any magnet. That still might be hard for you to understand. Well, there aren't any 2 poles. Yes, there are 2 poles. Why are there 2 poles? Because any spatial extrapolation necessitates polarity, the antinomy of which at the center of any polarity is counterspace. This line you see here drawn on this magnetic viewing film that you see now, that is the line of counterspace. That is the dielectric inertial plane, the coherency of which, right here, North Pole, South Pole. The antithesis of all polarity, each one of these is an atom. The conglomeration of all these is field incommensurability. All these little atoms have been induced or charged. They're all sitting in perfect coherency. Now we have an assemblage, a mass of atoms or molecules acting as a magnet, diverging, converging. The center point of which is counterspace. We have magnetic centrifugal convergence here, and we have the dielectric inertial plane sitting at the center of what? The center of the antinomies of all spatial expression. Everything over here is space. This is space, 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 space. The center, the opposite of all space in any phenomenal object, right here along the middle of this magnet, and right here along this counterspace. Yes, the universe is a lot more simple than you realized. Mother Nature doesn't do fucking math. Math is an expression of phenomenal interactions. Before we have phenomena, we have simplex field modalities which don't require math. They do, however, require wisdom and insight, something that doesn't exist anymore. It requires an ancient methodology that the Greek Platonists used. It's called retroductive ontology, called retroduction, something that doesn't exist anymore and isn't taught anymore. So thanks for watching video 102. Hope it wasn't too dry and boring. Uncovering the Missing Secrets of Magnetism will also be explained in much greater detail in the upcoming 4th and 5th editions.